So I see a lot of people struggle with shading, and actually I'm not surprised why. I had to almost learn this myself because most of what you see online tends to go about the same shading process you always see, which is light and shadow, which, don't get me wrong, is a great way to learn how to paint, especially from reference. And so that was my issue with it, because what I wanted to do is I wanted to learn to draw from imagination. I also wanted to give things realistic form from imagination. And so every time you go online, what you get is the sphere, and then you learn to sort of find the shadow form of that sphere, and you fill in that shadow shape, and then you add the terminator, because the terminator is where, the light meets the shadow side, and it's the darkest side, or one of the darkest, except for the ambient occlusion. And then you get the bounce line, and then you get the halftones, and blah, 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 blah. That's fine. It works, but it didn't work for me. The reason it didn't work for me is because I'm a little bit more analytical when it comes to drawing, and I didn't want to use reference that much. That's not to say that I didn't want to learn how to draw from reference or use reference in my art. That's not what I'm saying. It's that I wanted to draw from imagination and therefore not rely that much on reference, which is a very big difference. If you rely too much on reference, how creative can you be? Because you're literally almost copying the reference, right? That's what I see a lot of students when they call their character design concept art. I can literally see the reference they used. And so for me, that's not drawing from imagination. Drawing from imagination is coming up with something that looks believable and using reference as a guide or as inspiration. So for me, and what I do for Artwod now, is I take people from a very simple concept to a very complicated concept, which is drawing faces from imagination and shading them as well. And what we actually teach them is how to indicate form. And that's very different, and it's a completely different mindset from shading. Again, as soon as shading comes up, and I know this because I thought it a lot, when shading comes up, all of these different principles come up. The terminator, bounce light, shadow mapping, halftones, light direction, material, all of that. And again, for me, what led to the success in the speed at which I improved for drawing is I wanted to simplify things as much as I could so that I could understand them. So what I teach people is that we learn to just indicate form. That means that we're going to learn to indicate form for a cylinder, and we're doing that based on following contour lines. So if we don't understand contour lines, we cannot really indicate form. That's why in our roadmap, we first teach you how to understand contour lines. Then we learn to indicate form. So we learn that for boxes, cylinders, and spheres, and we learn to indicate by using the contour lines how to basically indicate form and plane changes. Because when we can do that, we can do it on more complicated objects as well. And for me, that's a very easy to understand concept. And I no longer had to struggle with the fact that I needed to keep all of these different principles in mind that I really didn't want to keep in my mind space at the time when I was drawing from imagination. As soon as because drawing is a juggling act. At first, just like driving a car or any endeavor, basically, you only have the mental capacity to juggle one or two things at the time. And then you can introduce a third, and then maybe you can introduce a fourth, but you cannot juggle 15 things at once in the beginning. So that's why for me, the core or sort of traditional concept of shading, it just didn't work for me. Indicating form works brilliantly for me, because when I want to shade, let's say, a nose, I'm only considering the concepts that I learned from the cylinder and the sphere and the box. Is I know the plane changes, and I only have to indicate the form following contour lines on those plane changes. And so that's all I'm concerned about. And for me, that really worked wonders. And it also helped me understand things like hair a lot better. Because hair, again, if we can simplify it, it's one shape, then other ribbon shapes sit on top of that. So we have like these ribbon shapes that you've undoubtedly seen before. But those ribbon shapes are basically just shapes wrapping around a simple cylinder. So again, when I go to indicate form, all I have to think about, and all I let my students think about, is the application of indicating form on these ribbon shapes and nothing else. Now, of course, later we can introduce why a highlight is a certain way, why we have halftones, why we have bounce light, why we'll have eventually ambient occlusion, that we make things darker, but we trickle that in. I think if you want to make your learning as effective as possible, it's about knowing your mental capacity and then working within that understanding and then only trickling in things when you're able to understand them. Similar to working out, as always, that's why I compare it to working out, is because you're not going to start with loading up super heavy weights or doing an ultra marathon. No, you're going to start with a little bit of it, what your body can handle, and then you're going to trickle in new things. It's the same with shading. So that's why I sort of broke it down into this more simplified concept of indicating form, not shading, following contour line. And again, you have to understand contour lines really well. You have to be able to first understand them on simple forms, then you'll have to be able to manipulate them, which at Artwod we call contour manipulation, and then you have to understand how you can indicate them on different forms and organic forms. And by doing that, you already can get so far. I have like our first part of our drawing with realism portrait road is completely following the concept of indicating form of simple objects. And you can achieve, like you see here, so much realism if you understand that concept. And the cool thing about this as well is that once you understand this principle of just indicating form and plane changes and contour lines, you'll have a much easier understanding of what I later talk about, which is the tiling method of painting, because it really heavily relates to each other. It's not the exact same principle, but it is very closely related because we're indicating form. But now the only thing we're doing is, instead of doing it with lines that indicate the form, we're transforming these lines into singular shapes. So it's no longer lines. It's basically like we're literally just putting shapes in place that are graphically well designed, obviously, with different values that represent the exact same thing. These lines that I indicate now on the eye, for instance, they become a certain shape in painting or even in inking. And it's that correlation. If you want to get better at anything, it's basically the sort of exercise and principle of learning how to make correlations between simple concepts, and those simple concepts then become compounded complex concepts. That's essentially the entire premise of learning. It's you start with something very simple, and then you correlate something with that simplicity with something else that is simple, that is a different type of learning, and then you compound those, and that becomes a new way, or that becomes your complicated way of drawing. What I mean by that is that if we draw a face or a head, right, with the Loomis head like this, right, if I do it like this, it seems straightforward, but there's a lot of compounded knowledge in this one drawing. I have form indication, I have perspective, I have form manipulation, I have to some degree some proportions of the human face. So there's compounded knowledge in this just one little tiny dirty sketch. And that's what I'm talking about when it comes to compounding knowledge. And that's something that I feel has helped me immensely in learning how to draw faster, just by breaking it down into digestible pieces of information that I can understand. So to anyone watching this, I would recommend, especially if you struggle with shading, is change your mindset from shading, to leave that alone for a while, to indicating form. And if you can understand how to indicate form, like I said with the principles here, or you can start checking it out for free on the Artwod Road, then I think at least, because it worked for me, I think at least you'll get a much better grasp on what shading actually is, because eventually shading is just creating things that look more believable. It's going from something that looks stylistic to making it more believable by giving it volume, three-dimensionality, and therefore believability. Try it, let me know if it works, and as always, enjoy drawing and stay creative.